Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Game Dev London podcast. My name is Adam. I am your host. You can refer to me as he, him. And today we're going to have a slightly more interesting episode because there's actually one host, which is obviously a bit of a change from the Game Dev London perspective. It's part of a thing that we're testing out. There's going to be a few more one-person episodes coming out in the next few weeks. But to start with, I want to talk about why I'm doing a one-person episode. And the reason for that is because we're starting to explore a new series over here at Game Dev London, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. And today I just want to kick it off, sort of introduce the ideas, what we're going to be talking about, and really to basically put a shout out there to get ideas from you people listening to our episodes. Now, to start with, I want to introduce the idea of what we're going to be talking about over the next whole bunch of episodes. You may have played a video game or two in the past, and one of the things that's really interested me about a lot of games, especially anything that's got open world elements, RPG elements, anywhere where you're kind of just exploring spaces, is there are a few common things that stick in all these games, right? Things that you may have seen in any game that you've played in it could be things like health bars, it could be things like stamina bars, it could be things like gold or currency or how you move a character, controls, all these kind of things. The common threads. Now, the one I'm going to focus in on just for the next 5-10 minutes is rocks. Now, specifically, I'm going to talk about rocks because rocks turn up in almost every video game that you've played that's got an open world element, and even some that you haven't, even some that don't, right? Because they turn up in background. If you've got a mountainous background or a hilly background, technically rocks are there, right? They're a cool fundamental, and we never really dive in most games into what those rocks are. And as I am a big fan of puns, you could almost say those rocks are taken for granted. So the things that really interested me here is that what if they weren't granite? What if the rocks had more of a purpose? What if the rocks were part of the history of the lore? Or what if you went up to those rocks and they weren't actually granite? They were actually, some kind of sedimentary rock, or they betrayed the history of the planet, or they were a meteorite and came from somewhere else. And that's essentially what this series wants to be looking at. So this series of episodes that's going to be coming out intermittently with the Game Dev London podcast. So there won't be every episode. It'll be here and there. It's called Taken for Granite, and it's about looking at things in video games that just are the case, things that we've just accepted as being, this is how they are, or this is what they might be, or this is how I'm going to do it because it's how it's been done before, and diving into them and looking at the good in terms of the current states. What things have we enjoyed about them, what areas are interesting, where have they been done well, but also nuances, things like where have they been done a little bit differently that's been of interest, where have they been just not used entirely, where has it been advantageous to just forget the things that have layered on this particular feature over, at this point, decades, that actually could be useful for developers, both big, small, AAA, and indie, to change your perspective on that particular feature and turn it into, and create more interesting, nuanced, alternative games that really explore those mechanics in ways that haven't been seen before and create novel experiences, the likes of which we've never seen. So, for example, with rocks, you may have seen, in certain games, games already do this. Let's take rocks as solid objects, right? If you take brick walls as an example of a rock, right, of just a thing that exists to barricade you from entering certain areas or block your path. If we take games like the Dark Souls or Soulsborne games, famously, sometimes walls aren't really walls, and you can just kind of walk through them because it creates this sense of not quite deception, but this idea that nothing is set, nothing is solid. Things can deceive you and make you think that they're going to be the same as you've experienced, game after game, over the course of an extended series, for example. When in fact, it actually is the case that these things may not be as you experience. We're seeing this now with modern games, and how this legacy now of what was originally once a deception becomes something that people expect, especially with more, the latest Dark Souls games or games from software, where people are going, actually, maybe this isn't going to be what I expect. Maybe things are going to be different. Equally, you get games where the rocks represent part of the gameplay. If you take, your Mario games and your Zelda games, things where you walk up to what you expect to just be a standard rock, and the rock runs away from you, and you have to chase it to get some kind of unlockable or to complete some kind of challenge or something to that effect. The idea here is that just because a rock is a rock doesn't mean it's actually the rock that you expect it to be. They are so, everything in a game can be so much more than you intended to be. And that's kind of why I want to explore. So what we really want here are your contributions. So if you go to gamedev.london/submit, I want you to tell us either through a video or audio submission. It can be text if you prefer. Things that you've seen in games that, just seem to be taken for granted, thinking that just are, and ask us to basically explore them. So I'm going to have a quick dive today into health. Health is the first one I want to kick off with. And the reason I want to start with health is because it's probably one of the first kind of features in games that started in arcade games back in the 80s and 70s and such, and has persisted to this day in one form or another. And with that, some of the legacy things that existed for very specific reasons has just been kept. Not because it works with today's features, but because it's legacy, because it's the way things are done. So famously, the original kind of example of health would have been lives, right? So if you take yourself back to your arcade games, your Marios, all this kind of thing, we represented health in the form of lives, that you had an amount of life that if you lost a life, you would lose the number of times you could play the game. You'd normally lose some progress, be put back to the beginning of a level or the beginning of a section, and then you would have to do it again. Two key examples for this that come to mind. Obviously, the Mario games. If you are at your smallest form, you take a hit, you are immediately dead, and you are put back to the beginning of the level. You can have health in other forms, like you can be, if you are the larger Mario or you're wearing an outfit, you can go back through stages, but ultimately it represents a forcing of a restarting of the level. Another good example being Sonic. If you get hit by something, if you have rings, you lose all the rings that you have on you. If you don't have rings, then you die and go back to the last checkpoint that you were at. Now, this comes from sort of a historical thing around arcade machines, where when our games were on arcade machines, the main point was to get people playing, right? Lots of people playing, putting money into machines, playing them over and over. And the easiest way to do that was to create some kind of permanency, some kind of way of saying, okay, you have now lost. You're out. If you want to keep playing, put more money into the machine, because the purpose was financially driven. Put more money in when you lose. And so these games all had lives for that reason. Take it back to the original kind of arcade games. You're looking at your Pac-Mans and your Space Invaders. They are all life driven, so that if you were to lose, you lose a life, eventually you lose the game, it all resets, and then if you want to keep playing, you put more money in. That was one of the original drivers of a kind of lives as an aspect of representing health in video games. Now, what's interesting is that even though arcades are not as dominant as they were, say, in sort of the 80s, we still get games to this day, especially games that harken back to those eras, your shmups and those kind of things, that continue to use lives as a way of measuring quote unquote health. And it has its advantages for sure, because it creates this kind of permanency. It creates a sense of risk and danger when you're attempting things, because there's a permanency to losing that life. You go back and start again. But it is a legacy thing. We don't have to do it like that. And interestingly, this is where other areas of representing health came in. So one of the earlier ones would have been something like a health bar, where health bars came in to represent a sense of health progression over time, your ability to lose and regain health. Instead of it being very kind of, if you get hit, it's over, it's more you have an amount to which you can get hit, and then once you are hit, now you're being reset. But again, it still works out as you being reset to the checkpoint at the start of the level, or whatever kind of equivalent it may be. And the further on we get from sort of the 90s and noughties into sort of modern day, the more we start to see games that dispense with health in view of a story. So games that really don't care about you as the player losing, essentially. The game is not about that. The game is not there for you to be lost. And this is where it starts to break away from that original idea. Obviously, the original plan was that you would lose the game, put more money in, and play through. And that constant sort of method of financing the game was how companies made their money and were able to pay for the next game, etc. Nowadays, obviously, there are a whole bunch of different ways. You buy the game outright, the more money goes to the individual who made, or the company that made the game, or there are subscription services and they're being paid in other ways. It matters less the financial gains made directly from literally playing the game in the first place. Obviously, it comes back in other forms like microtransactions, etc., but that's a whole kind of different ballgame that's sort of been a modern interpretation of that business model. So looking at games nowadays, so take games like Curse of the Obra Dinn, or any kind of game where it's more about the you play for, or Gone Home, for example, right? These games are about the story, they're not about your capacity to win or lose. The challenge comes from your capacity to navigate and explore and make decisions and progress through a preset or procedural story, depending on the game, and not about you the challenge of you being victorious given a constrained space for in which to complete a challenge. And that's where we start to see people start playing around with the idea of what is health and how important is it to a video game. Because if you went to the average person and said, "Oh, health is health an important part of games?" They'd probably say yes, because it's an easy form of representing challenge. But actually, you can get a huge amount of creative initiative and development from removing that concept altogether. And some games do other things with health. So if we take a look at Hellblade, for example, and spoilers again, if spoilers for this kind of thing, but it's not massive spoilers. When you lose in Hellblade, you get reset to a certain point, and then you continue onwards. However, you take with you basically a representation of the psychosis that you're experiencing as you lose. So the more you lose, the more damaged your character becomes. And this kind of taking of the history of your character through with you into each life, that kind of permanency is pretty novel in terms of other games. Normally, when you die, you go back to the beginning, and either nothing changes, or you take some kind of gains or equipment or something with you or even if it's just knowledge that goes along with you for the rest of the game. In this case, you actually have, to some extent, maybe not necessarily a weakness, but you certainly have some kind of representation of the negative impact of losing over multiple times, which reflects on the narrative aspect of the game, and how health can be played as a narrative tool as opposed to purely a means of challenge is certainly a space that more people are exploring in sort of more modern games and certainly in indie games. There are other games as well that kind of take health as not a means to an end, but again as a sort of a narrative connective. So for example, the Outer Wilds, which you may have heard me talk about before, and I definitely am not going to spoil that. Part of the game is that health, you losing your health is kind of built into the structure of the narrative. If you this is a very slight spoiler, but if you look into it though, Outer Wilds has a sense that when you die or lose lose your health, you're put back to the beginning of the game, but the game is about the knowledge that you take with you, so you literally cannot lose anything because of the narrative structure. You learn more about the world and you take that knowledge with you regardless. This is both in terms of you as the person who's playing the game. You've learned more, you're taking that with you, and that's great, but it also manifests in the game itself. It has a log, which every time you discover something, you find something out, updates with the persistence of, you've discovered this thing, here it is to read again. So you're not forced to basically remember everything as you go through. You can go to your log and go, what have I learned so far? Which is obviously useful if you play for 10, 15, 20 hours and you need to remember something from the beginning. But again, it's an example of this kind of health as a story, as a built-in storytelling mechanic, that it syncs up with what's going on in the game, as opposed to just a very sort of discrete way of stopping your progress when you're failing at a challenge and putting you back to the beginning.